Hollywood's golden age gave us timeless films, legendary stars, and images of glamour that defined American culture. But behind those perfect smiles and carefully crafted public images lurked something far more primal. Explosive tempers, massive egos, and fists that flew when the cameras stopped rolling were as much a part of the industry as the cameras themselves. The studios didn't just manufacture stars, they contained them, revealed a former MGM security guard who worked during the 1950s. Far from the adoring gaze of the public, these were not publicity stage fights, but real eruptions of rage between some of Hollywood's biggest names. Some of the industry's most legendary partnerships were forged in literal blood stars, who became lifelong friends only after they had tried to knock each other unconscious. Tonight, we reveal the 10 most shocking fistfights of Hollywood's golden age violent confrontations between iconic stars that studio publicity departments successfully buried for decades. From beloved comedians throwing haymakers to screen goddesses engaging in physical combat, these explosive moments expose the raw, unfiltered reality behind Hollywood's most carefully polished legends. 1. Frank Sinatra versus Mario Lanza. When he threw hands, it was to reveal both his brilliance and volatility. Frank Sinatra had made a transformation from a skinny kid from Hoboken into the chairman of the board, commanding respect wherever he went. That came with a notoriously short fuse and a willingness to back his words up with his fists. Mario Lanza, the operatic tenor with movie star looks, represented everything Sinatra had worked so hard to become, a classically trained vocalist whose natural gift Sinatra had spent years in developing through sheer discipline and persistence. The confrontation took place at a glamorous Beverly Hills party, according to a former member of Sinatra's entourage who witnessed the clash. It was an A-list industry gathering filled with some of the biggest names in show business. But instead of polite conversation and champagne toasts, the evening turned into something out of one of Sinatra's Vegas stories. The trouble reportedly began when a slightly intoxicated Lanza made offhand comments about Sinatra's vocal technique and his diminutive stature to subjects that touched on the singer's deepest insecurities. Sinatra, who stood just 5 feet 7 inches in an era when leading men were expected to be tall and commanding, had fought his entire life to overcome such judgments. According to witnesses, Lanza's teasing struck a nerve. Without warning, Sinatra reportedly sucker-punched Lanza after being mocked about his height and voice. What followed was pure chaos. Furniture shattered as the two stars clashed in a flurry of fists and fury, sending Hollywood royalty scattering for safety. Those present described Sinatra's first blow as lightning-fast and wholly unexpected, catching the larger Lanza off guard. The tenor tried to fight back, but the room erupted into pandemonium before security could step in. By the time the two were separated, the damage to both the venue and their reputations was considerable. The chairman of the board threw a right hook like he was back on the docks in Hoboken, said one actress present at the party. Everybody knew about Sinatra's temper, but to see him attack another major star like that, without hesitation, was a shock even for Hollywood. In the immediate days and weeks that followed, management teams from both men worked furiously to contain the fallout. Damaged property was paid for without fanfare, apologies were delivered, and an agreement was made by both sides never to publicly acknowledge the incident. The pact of silence held for decades, ensuring the story survived only as a whispered legend within industry circles. In the end, the fight between Sinatra and Lanza became more than just another Hollywood scuffle. It was a snapshot of Sinatra's dual nature. 2. John Wayne versus Ward Bond. When the Duke defended his honor. John Wayne and Ward Bond appeared in dozens of films together, creating one of Hollywood's most enduring on-screen partnerships. Their real-life friendship lasted for decades and managed to survive professional rivalry, political clashes, and even a violent altercation that could have ended their bond before it began. According to longtime Hollywood insiders, the two men's legendary camaraderie was forged through an explosive confrontation early in their careers, one that left both their tempers and their pride bruised. One veteran prop master reported that the fight indeed occurred on the set of a Western. Both actors were still trying to find their place in the industry at the time. Wayne was especially sensitive about being taken seriously, as he was transitioning from a stuntman/prop hand into being a leading man. Bond had been around a little longer and was known for his candid and often tactless remarks. During a rehearsal, Bond allegedly made disparaging comments about Wayne's acting ability. Comments that cut deep for a man who had spent years struggling to prove he was more than just a rugged frame in front of a camera. One camera operator says Wayne didn't respond with words. Bond insulted Wayne's acting. Wayne allegedly cold-cocked him mid-rehearsal, the operator remembered. This wasn't any kind of shoving match or some sort of stage bit of roughhousing. Wayne threw a real punch, one meant to do damage, and it dropped Bond instantly. The set erupted into chaos as crew members rushed in to separate the two men. Even being restrained, both actors continued to struggle toward each other, their fury boiling over in a scene reportedly terrifying to the people present. A production assistant later revealed that crew members had to use prop rifles as physical barriers to keep the men apart, not as weapons, but simply as a way to hold them back. These were two powerful men in their prime, the assistant said. You couldn't just step between them and expect to stay standing. The aftermath of the altercation left the production tense for several days. Scenes had to be scheduled carefully to keep the actors apart until tempers cooled. But eventually, the situation took an unexpected turn. Bond, instead of holding a grudge, respected Wayne for standing up for himself. And Wayne, in turn, came to value Bond's bluntness as a mark of honesty rather than insult. The Duke didn't settle things with words. He settled them with fists, says a longtime friend of both men. What's remarkable isn't that they fought. Plenty of actors came to blows back then. What's extraordinary is that this fight built the foundation of a friendship that lasted until Bond's death. Over time, the two men forged a relationship based on brutal candor and mutual respect. They could argue and yell and even swing at each other, but beneath it all lay a deep-seated loyalty that few Hollywood partnerships ever enjoyed. 3. Bette Davis versus Joan Crawford, Hollywood's most vicious feud turned physical. This rivalry between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford is considered one of the most famous in Hollywood history. For decades, the two actresses fought for roles, awards, and the adoration of the public. Such animosity manifests in cutting remarks, professional sabotage, and bitter resentment that spanned over 3 decades. Fewer people realize, though, that their feud ostensibly turned violent during the filming of their only collaboration, the 1962 psychological thriller Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? But according to one wardrobe assistant who worked on the production, the set of Baby Jane was less a movie studio than a battleground. By the time they made this film, these women had hated each other for 30 years, the assistant recalled. The studio thought pairing them would create magical tension on screen. What it actually created was a war zone where the crew deserved combat pay. The film's director, Robert Aldrich, had hoped their rivalry would add realism to the story of two decaying Hollywood sisters locked in mutual torment. He got more realism than he ever expected. The physical confrontations reportedly occurred during the more violent scenes of the movie, where the line between acting and genuine aggression became dangerously blurred. In one particularly intense moment, Bette Davis's character was supposed to attack Crawford's. According to a set electrician who witnessed the scene, Davis went far beyond the choreography, allegedly kicking Crawford in the head with such force that she later showed Aldrich a lump on her scalp. Was it an accident? Technically possible, said one crew member. But nobody who saw it thought so. Crawford was known for her icy composure and taste for strategic revenge, and she waited until it was time to strike back. In a later scene in which Davis had to drag Crawford's limp body across the floor, Crawford had filled her costume with heavy weights. Knowing Davis had problems with her back, Crawford knew this would indeed cause pain as Davis dragged her across the floor. The ploy worked. Davis injured her back during filming and endured months of pain. To the crew, this wasn't just on-set tension. It was psychological and physical warfare conducted under studio lighting. The atmosphere on set was electric with hostility. Crew members stayed constantly on their toes, fearing the next outburst would either delay production or cause serious injury. "It was Hollywood's first true horror movie, and most of it was real," said a makeup artist who worked with both actresses. The hatred that simmered between Davis and Crawford gave their performances a terrifying authenticity, one that audiences could feel emanating from a screen. Ironically, it was that same hostility that would make Whatever Happened to Baby Jane a classic. For Humphrey Bogart versus director John Huston, when collaborators collided. Humphrey Bogart and John Huston created some of cinema's most enduring classics together, including The Maltese Falcon, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and The African Queen. Their creative partnership produced masterpieces because both men shared an unrelenting passion for storytelling, uncompromising artistic standards, and strong, often clashing personalities. But according to those who worked alongside them, that same intensity sometimes exploded into physical confrontations, especially when alcohol entered the mix, which was a frequent occurrence for both. The most infamous altercation reportedly took place on the set of The African Queen in 1951. The shoot was brutal. Shot on location in the African jungle, it was a far cry from the comforts of a typical Hollywood set. The cast and crew were hounded by blistering heat, disease-carrying insects, unsafe drinking water, and isolation that eventually wore on everyone's nerves. They were both heavy drinkers, even under ideal circumstances, recalled a production assistant. Out there, surrounded by chaos, it didn't take much for things to boil over. One evening, after an especially grueling day's shooting, Bogart and Huston shared drinks and began debating a scene's direction. What started as a creative disagreement quickly turned into a shouting match. It began with raised voices, then finger-pointing, recalled the camera operator. Next thing we knew, they were shoving each other, then throwing punches. It was like watching two bull elephants collide. Furniture splintered, chairs were overturned, and before anyone could intervene, the director and his star were on the ground, grappling and trading blows. Both men ended up bloodied, their fight fueled as much by whiskey as by ego. The violence in this confrontation was nothing new, but what came after was. The two men were fully reconciled by morning. "They laughed it off," said a script supervisor who witnessed the aftermath. "Just two pals having it out." They came onto the set with bruises and Bogart sporting a split lip, which Huston decided to write into the film. He wouldn't cover up the wound, but rather wrote it into the character's rough, weather-beaten features. For both men, the physical altercation was merely another kind of conversation, brutal but honest. It was on that raw authenticity that their relationship thrived. They fought and drank and made movies that captured the same intensity that fueled their real-life partnership. A film historian would later say, their occasional fights weren't acts of hatred. They were explosions of passion from two men who refused to compromise. In a business built on pretense, the willingness of Bogart and Huston to confront each other so directly, even physically, became part of their bond. The fight on The African Queen wasn't unique. Throughout their years of collaboration, there were several smaller clashes moments when strong opinions turned into shoves or shouting matches. But these moments never damaged their friendship. If anything, they seemed to clear the air. They'd fight, shake hands, pour another drink, and go back to work, said one actor who knew them both. There was no grudging bitterness or scheming afterward, just mutual respect. 5. Errol Flynn versus a critic at a nightclub. When the swashbuckler struck back. Errol Flynn defined Hollywood swashbuckling with his performances in films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood, projecting an image of dashing heroism and effortless physical prowess. According to Hollywood insiders, Flynn's real-life persona often mirrored his on-screen character, including a readiness to respond to insults with immediate physical action rather than words or legal maneuvers. One columnist quipped that Flynn's best acting was in courtrooms, not on film, a particularly cutting remark given the actor's highly publicized 1943 trial for statutory rape. Though acquitted, the case left Flynn sensitive to any reference to it. The infamous incident reportedly took place at an upscale Hollywood nightclub, where Flynn was socializing with friends and industry figures. A film critic, emboldened by alcohol and a public setting, allegedly approached Flynn's table and made a deliberately provocative remark within earshot of witnesses. According to a nightclub regular who saw the event unfold, Flynn responded without hesitation. He allegedly delivered a single, perfectly placed punch that knocked the critic unconscious, then calmly returned to his drink, tipping the waiter, who had to manage the aftermath. The blow happened so swiftly that many patrons didn't even realize what had occurred until the critic was already on the floor. But what made this confrontation particularly noteworthy was Flynn's complete lack of concern about consequences. Unlike other stars who utilized entourages or fixers for dealing with confrontations, Flynn handled this instance personally and without hesitation, regardless of the public setting. A fellow actor who knew him well explained that Flynn lived by a personal code honed long before Hollywood. Insult to his face demanded physical response. One punch equated to justice and statement for Flynn, and he handed it out with the same elan as his swashbuckling on-screen heroics. The aftermath included a quiet exit from the nightclub before the police could get involved and generous payments to the establishment and the critic for the sake of keeping it all quiet. Before cameras and social media were ubiquitous, publicity controlled by the studios let such incidents stay, for the most part, behind closed doors. It was an open secret in Hollywood that Flynn was quite willing to take on critics physically, yet this incident became legendary because of the public setting, the one-punch efficiency, and the nonchalant manner of Flynn throughout. 6. Lee Marvin versus Marlon Brando method, acting turns to mayhem. Lee Marvin and Marlon Brando represented two very different ways of approaching the intensity of method acting. Marvin brought his real-world combat experience as a Marine in World War II to roles that radiated authentic toughness, while Brando revolutionized American acting with raw emotional vulnerability and electric, unpredictable energy. At least according to Hollywood lore, when these two powerhouses clashed in a Tijuana bar in the early 1960s, the result was a fight as legendary as any of their on-screen performances. The encounter is said to have begun quite innocently. Both happened to be in Baja California at the time for various reasons, Brando possibly scouting locations, Marvin likely just drinking his way through Mexico. A fellow actor who claimed to have been a witness to the incident recalled that at one point, the two shared drinks and mutual professional respect. But as the evening wore on and alcohol loosened tongues and tempers, the conversation turned to a theoretical debate. Who could win in a real street fight? Marvin would later tell a production assistant it was a discussion about contrasting approaches to the portrayal of violence on screen, where Marvin's was military-trained efficiency and Brando's was wild, unpredictable intensity. Somehow, the debate escalated into an actual demonstration. Witnesses described a chaotic brawl that spilled from inside the bar into an alley, a no-holds-barred confrontation between two men with extensive real-life fighting experience. Unlike choreographed cinematic violence, this was unpredictable, messy, and dangerous. Both actors came out of it bruised and bleeding, with Marvin reportedly saying, "He's crazier than I am," according to a stunt coordinator who worked with them later. The clash was not some kind of general drunken flailing, but a real test of both skill, power, and instinct. Marvin's combat training clashed with Brando's raw, untamed physicality in a manner that was as perilous as it was unforgettable. What made this fight particularly memorable, however, was its aftermath. It concluded not in ill will, but in mutual respect. Both men recognized in the other a rare, genuine intensity that transcended the ordinary Hollywood bluster. A director who knew the two actors said, "Two alpha lunatics, one bar, no survivors." Neither of the two men voiced any regret or embarrassment about the incident. Quite to the contrary, both would occasionally bring up the fight with affection in later years, as if this physical test had forged some sort of unique bond, a connection deeper than the usual superficial Hollywood relationships. 7. James Cagney versus a Warner Brothers executive. When money matters got physical. James Cagney made his career playing tough guys and gangsters, bringing into the roles an uncommon degree of menace and charisma that defined the gangster genre. He was generally known, off-screen, as professional and controlled, even surprisingly gentle. Yet, Hollywood insiders remember one explosive incident in which Cagney's real-life persona rivaled his on-screen intensity, a physical confrontation with a studio executive over financial matters. Cagney had long chafed at being underpaid. Though one of Warner Brothers' biggest stars, he was stuck in a long-term contract he'd signed before his fame, which kept him well beneath his market value. According to one former Warner Brothers contract player, this simmering resentment occasionally boiled over. The incident reportedly came during a heated meeting in which Cagney sought to renegotiate his contract. When the executive brushed him off with a patronizing remark, "You're lucky to be here," Cagney's normally collected calm broke. The comment was the perfect provocation for a man who had fought his way up from the Lower East Side and saw the studio's treatment as exploitative, recalled the studio accountant who overheard the altercation. According to multiple sources, Cagney responded immediately and with precision. A security guard called to the executive's office later confirmed that Cagney allegedly punched the executive in the throat before calmly walking out. This was not a theatrical Hollywood display or a shoving match. It was a deliberate, targeted strike meant to assert his point. The aftermath included hasty damage control by studio lawyers, medical attention for the executive, and ultimately a renegotiated contract for Cagney. Rather than firing their star, Warner Brothers recognized that his outburst reflected legitimate grievances demanding resolution. A fellow actor who worked with Cagney on multiple films explained, "He played gangsters because he thought like one. Jimmy understood power dynamics instinctively. He knew exactly when and how to deploy force to get results." That single punch reportedly earned him more than a year of polite negotiation ever could have. Cagney's willingness to back financial demands with physical action distinguished him from contemporaries who often accepted exploitative contracts without protest. His approach reflected both his working-class upbringing and a clear understanding of Hollywood power structures. What gave Cagney's actions their particular force was their precision. This was not some blind rage or loss of control, a film historian observed, but a calculating demonstration of how far he would go. Delivered in the language that studio executives instinctively understood, it achieved what the legal maneuvering of 1930s Hollywood often could not. Such physical confrontations would be unthinkable in contemporary Hollywood. In Cagney's era, and under his peculiar circumstances, star power, real grievance, and an industrial culture of tolerable directness, it became an unforgettable example of assertion and strategy. 8. Steve McQueen versus Yul Brynner, when the Magnificent Seven became the Magnificent Feud. John Sturges' 1960 Western brought together an extraordinary ensemble cast of established and rising stars, including the commanding Yul Brynner and the ambitious, scene-stealing Steve McQueen. According to production insiders, the on-screen camaraderie between these two masked an increasingly bitter rivalry that eventually erupted into a physical confrontation in front of the cameras. An assistant director who worked on the film confirmed the tensions that developed throughout production. Right from the outset, there was tension between Brynner, who clearly considered himself the undisputed star of the piece, and McQueen, equally determined to make his presence felt and steal the scene whenever he could. Professional rivalry soon spilled into personal. According to sources, the root of the conflict lay in McQueen's calculated attempts to steal scenes intended for his co-star. By making slight adjustments with his costume, casually changing positions, or executing background business when Brynner had lines, McQueen seemed determined to upstage the star at every available opportunity. A camera operator witness to the brewing tension said he would play with his hat during Brynner's lines or adjust his gun belt at crucial moments. Small actions, but deliberately competitive. As production continued, Brynner grew increasingly frustrated, viewing McQueen's behavior as disrespectful and unprofessional. Initially, he attempted to resolve the issue through private conversations, requests via the director, and clear boundary setting. When these efforts failed, the rivalry escalated dramatically. After weeks of tension, a critical scene reached a boiling point. During a sequence in which their characters were supposed to be planning strategy together, something McQueen did, perhaps a gesture or movement during Brynner's dialogue, pushed Brynner over the edge. Multiple witnesses reported that Brynner shoved McQueen mid-take, catching both the younger actor and the crew by surprise. McQueen immediately shoved back, creating a genuine physical altercation. The director allowed the cameras to keep rolling, either in shock or recognizing that the real tension might enhance the scene. When egos collide, the camera just keeps rolling, a sound technician who recorded the incident said afterward. Astoundingly, both actors were able to harness their real anger and fold it seamlessly into their performances, continuing the scene as if the altercation had been scripted. Though the finished film disguised it for audiences, crew members knew real hostility was lurking beneath the surface. The incident resulted in a complete breakdown in communication between the two stars. For the remainder of production, they refused to speak directly to one another, communicating only through intermediaries. The director and crew had to maintain two separate working relationships, holding individual meetings with each actor before scenes in which their characters interacted. 9. Laurence Olivier versus Dustin Hoffman, when two acting worlds collided. During the 1976 thriller Marathon Man, two titans of performance from wholly different traditions came together. Laurence Olivier, the archetype of traditional British theatrical training, and Dustin Hoffman, one of the leading figures in America's new generation of method actors, were thrust together on a high-stakes production. According to production insiders, their fundamentally different approaches to acting caused tensions that boiled over into a physical altercation, symbolizing the clash between Hollywood's past and future. A production assistant corroborated the growing friction between the two stars. Olivier, who was fighting cancer during filming, was absolutely professional, showing up prepared, knowing his lines, and working each scene for its exactness in detail. Hoffman, on the other hand, had fully invested in method acting, using radical methods to build up genuine emotional responses in scenes, including sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and emotional self-manipulation. While Hoffman's behavior made for some really convincing scenes, it also extended the hours of filming and worked against Olivier's structured approach. Recalled a camera operator, Hoffman's extreme preparation drove Olivier to frustration, famously making him say, "My dear boy, why don't you try acting?" The physical altercation reportedly occurred after a particularly grueling day of shooting. Hoffman's method-induced unpredictability had forced numerous retakes, extending the workday beyond schedule. Olivier, already weakened by illness, reached a breaking point with what he considered unnecessary and self-indulgent behavior. According to a makeup artist present, Olivier called Hoffman a clown, prompting Hoffman to shove him. In response, Olivier allegedly slapped Hoffman, surprising both the younger actor and himself. The incident took place in Olivier's dressing room after filming had concluded for the day. Both men retreated to separate corners, visibly shaken by the intensity with which their professional disagreement had escalated. A director summarized the event. Stage royalty met movie madness, and fists flew. But really compelling here was just how this conflict symbolized the broader evolution of acting methodology. Olivier represented the disciplined, technically precise approach that had dominated for generations, while Hoffman seemed to speak for the emotionally immersive techniques revolutionizing American cinema. Their clash was a literal collision of those two worlds. After the confrontation, both actors remained professional, completing production with performances that many critics regard as among their best. The tension between Olivier's Nazi dentist and Hoffman's graduate student was imbued with an added degree of intensity derived from real friction between the actors themselves. 10. Kirk Douglas versus director Anatole Litvak, when the star fought back. Kirk Douglas made his career playing intense, sometimes tormented characters who would not back down from a fight. A screen persona said to have mirrored his real-life demand for respect and professional consideration. Insiders claimed one director, who didn't take the hint on set, learned a painful lesson in trying to take on the dignity of Douglas, as their working relationship turned into one of Hollywood's most shocking physical star-director confrontations. A script supervisor confirmed to ET having witnessed the incident during the production of a 1950s film. Litvak was notorious for his demanding, at times demeaning, directorial style, one that had succeeded with more compliant actors, but proved calamitously mismatched with Douglas's pride. The confrontation reportedly evolved from a series of tensions rather than being sparked by a single incident. The increasingly harsh public criticism by Litvak of Douglas's choices in performance created a progressively hostile work environment. According to several accounts, the director's method was to scream instructions and critiques in view of the whole crew, which Douglas regarded as unprofessional and counterproductive. The breaking point came after a particularly complex, emotional scene. Litvak allegedly berated Douglas in front of the cast and crew, ignoring repeated requests for more professional communication. A camera operator who witnessed the incident recalled, Litvak tried to direct Douglas by yelling. Douglas responded by throwing a chair and landing a punch to the jaw. It was not an impulsive reaction, but the culmination of weeks of mounting frustration. A production assistant noted that the set fell silent for nearly 20 minutes, first from shock at Litvak's unusually harsh criticism, then from stunned amazement at Douglas's response. The notion of a major star physically confronting a director was almost unthinkable in Hollywood at the time. What lent this confrontation its particular significance was the way in which it radically altered the on-set dynamic. Rather than being sacked, Douglas's actions reportedly led to Litvak adopting a far more collaborative and respectful attitude toward his direction of the actor. A fellow actor later remembered, "Kirk didn't take notes. He gave them with knuckles." Afterwards, Litvak spoke to Douglas almost deferentially, making suggestions rather than issuing demands, and generally acting in a manner that betrayed a newly established respect for professional boundaries. Surprisingly, the incident produced no lasting harm to either man's career. In the era and within Hollywood's cultural milieus, those who knew understood that Litvak's provocative style had invited the response he received. Most co-workers who knew about the altercation personally felt Douglas was extreme but understandable. A film historian explained that what differentiated this fight from the common Hollywood fight was its effectiveness. It wasn't an emotional release or temporary loss of control, but rather it structurally reorganized the working relationship in such a way as to improve the final product. Litvak proved a more effective director for Douglas after lines were clearly drawn, and the project moved on with a new, dynamic sense. It has remained legendary within Hollywood lore as a point where, in rare cases indeed, physical confrontation resolved professional conflict rather than exacerbated it.